We're here on the beautiful island of Saint Lucia. We'll talk today about Saint Lucian foreign policy, education in Saint Lucia, politics in general. And our special guest is the Foreign Minister of Saint Lucia, Mr. George Odlum. So don't go anywhere. Carib Nation is up next. Welcome to Carib Nation. My name is David Hines. We are here in Saint Lucia, the country that has produced two Nobel Prize winners, Sir Arthur Lewis and most recently Derek Walcott, the playwright and poet. We are going to talk today with the Foreign Minister of Saint Lucia, Mr. George Odlum, who is no stranger to politics. Mr. Odlum has been involved in Saint Lucian politics since the 1960s. Of course, we're going to touch on various issues, even though we're going to concentrate on foreign policy. Foreign Minister George Odlum, welcome to Carib Nation.
Thank you.
Let me ask you I guess a relatively difficult question to begin with. Do you think foreign policy is still important for small states like St. Lucia?
Even more important now than it was before, in view of the globalization. It's a question that whether you should be left out of the globalization completely. Sometimes when I look at the trading blocks arranging themselves, I want to say, stop the world, we want to get off, because it looks so structured against small states. But we have come to the conclusion in CARICOM that we have to get in there with the process. And recently we've seen the benefits of that. The fact that you have a voice internationally, and the CARICOM voice can be pretty strong, because most of the leaders of the countries of the CARICOM are fairly articulate people who could put the points of view well. And they carry a voice out of all proportion to their size in the councils of the world. So I think it's very important that we stay in there and see if we could keep reminding the developed world that the process of globalization, that chain will be as strong as its weakest link. And in that, we'll see whether we could get some consideration. I was about to say protection, but I changed the word because, you know, the WTO now, and the whole thrust of liberalization of trade is to stop the protection. So we have to find a way of living with that.
Make the connection for me between foreign policy, between all these international meetings that you would attend. Make the connection between those meetings and the lives of the ordinary St. Lucians, the ordinary Caribbean person, the farmer, the peasant, the worker. Make the connection.
All right, well, the recent action of the World Trade Organization tells you immediately that everything the farmer does and the arrangement of the market and everything is determined now by international rules of trade, adjudicated on by the World Trade Organization. So these large meetings take decisions that have direct consequence on the farmer and on the small person in small communities too. It is seen now that in order to develop any nation, you have to develop the whole area so that they're not the inequities which bring about trouble and sometimes even revolution. So the approach is to tackle the whole hemisphere. And I was amazed to see that there were plans to have complete primary education in the entire hemisphere, 100% by a certain date. I think it's 2010.
Do you think such a plan would be beneficial to a small country like St. Lucia?
Extremely, because although Sir Arthur Lewis said some time ago, with a lot of validity, that the cure for poverty is not money, but education, right? That education costs a lot of money, and beyond the scope and the capability of a lot of the small territories. So if we included in a block arrangement like that, the funding and capitalization will be a bit easier. But my problem is that we might have to fine-tune our education so that although we do the broad things like primary education for all, secondary education for all, we must fine-tune it so that the local conditions, the culture could be reflected, and we could still produce Nobel laureates even though we're in that broad system.
Do you think that the conditions here are conducive to that transformation of the education system? Of course, we are out of independence now for almost 2 decades, but by and large in the Caribbean, what we have retained to this day is the same kind of colonial educational structures. And it seems to me that if we're going to do what you're talking about,
yes,
we'll have to really tackle the thing at the structure level. Comment on that for me.
Very true. I think one of the things that I admire Cuba most for was the fact that they got down to grips with the illiteracy problem, and within 5 or 6 years, they'd wiped it out completely. I feel a lot of us in the Caribbean have failed in that we didn't follow that pattern. And so illiteracy is still hanging around, 40% in some countries, a little higher in others. Now, I think that is the basis for starting the educational transformation. But after that, we have to think of education as local. I think it's Walcott who once said that our job is Adam's task of naming things. So our education should start with an identification of the immediate environment, a description of it, an appreciation of its qualities, and move out from there into a regional thing, and probably then link up internationally. So the point I'm making here is that the education cannot be superimposed by a colonial power. It must start out of the local experience. Only the local is real.
On my way here to St. Lucia on the plane, I was reading a series of articles by George Lamin, Rex Nettleford, and Michael Manley, in which they were talking about the whole issue of culture, yeah, and its relationship to education. And of course, you know, George Lamin is very big on cultural imperialism and so on, and the need for an indigenous form of education that is rooted in the culture of the Caribbean. Talk about the relationship between St. Lucian and Caribbean culture and this new educational thrust that you mentioned just now.
Yes, well, you have called names of people who have been ringing that bell in the Caribbean for a few years now, mercifully, because we had all fancy ideas of what education was. But education must come out of the total cultural experience, and it must teach us not to learn things by rote, but to develop a kind of deductive system where we could reason. And the reasoning must come out of our experience and out of an appreciation of other universal principles. So the emphasis must change, because the children who came out of our colonial schools, they learned, as Virginia Paul would say, like mimic men. They just parroted what people said, sometimes without even understanding it. The approach to the education must be different now. It must teach them to understand and teach them to look at premises and arrive at conclusions from these premises. So it's a process of reasoning rather than stuffing education into a head, as they say. especially now with information is so available with the internet and the computer now, that there's less reliance on cramming and learning things. If you can get the information at the press of a button, then there's almost no use to store it. But the more vital part of the process is the reasoning process. We should produce a kind of citizen that is able to solve problems. I'm not talking about nuclear problems or problems of existence in philosophy, but he must be able, in his normal life, to use the educative process to bring to bear on the problems that confront him, as simple as they might seem, and arrive at solutions from them. Then we are producing a man within the totality of his environment.
Some people have said that government need to get out of education and that the private sector should get into education. How react to that?
Well, I have a reservation about this total involvement of the private sector, because our problem in these islands is getting the surplus redistributed. And the private sector, like most private sectors, are there very often to turn the profit, to make the surplus, but the distribution becomes dodgy. I still feel that the government must have a hand in the distribution, shaping where the schools go, that everybody gets things evenly. That is my reservation about that type of education. If the government has a broad policy of looking after everybody equitably, it is more of a guarantee that the education would be well distributed than if it was farmed out to private sector. This is a reservation I have about that.
There is a feeling, Mr. Odlum, that the state as we know it, the government as we know it, is becoming less and less important in the process of development. Some people have talked about the withering away of the state, not in Marxian terms,
yes.
but certainly in terms of the downplaying of the role of the state in the affairs of the country. First of all, have you seen a minimizing of the role of the state? And the second question is, do you think that the state really ought to get out of a number of these areas?
Yes, I think a lot of what is happening now is a realization that a government can't work the total magic that needs to be worked. And people are finding that they have to fall back on their own resources. In past, we perceived the government as, the arbiter of all decisions and the holder of power, and that power is not often used as it should be. So the people are coming to an awareness now that they should depend less on the government. And the recent development of groups like the NGOs and other organizations means that there's a feeling that the people and the individuals have to depend more on themselves and less on government. That's not a bad thing. However, I feel that there's a cyclical development to this. It builds up, and if the bureaucracy gets oppressive, then there's a movement to divest and to let decision-making go more to the periphery. But the other thing happens sometimes. If it's divested too widely, then there's the need for pulling it in together. So it all depends on the balance of power that one could achieve in any particular state.
Let's go back to foreign policy. You were foreign minister in the last Labour government, 1979 to 1982. And of course, before you became foreign minister in this new Labour government, you did a stint at the United Nations as their ambassador for Saint Lucia. What has changed in terms of foreign policy and foreign policy thrust in the Caribbean and the world at large since 1979-82 and the present?
Well, the most obvious change is the Cold War. In 1979, we were preoccupied with the Cold War and the West versus Russia. And the West saw in every single movement the encroachment of Russia and Cuba, and the Caribbean became a theater of war in a way in which the two powers were fighting. Now, with the collapse of that, now it's a little freer in the sense that it's polarized more in the direction of trade. Now, in some ways, the trade war is as vicious as the political war, in that the large countries are really going to consolidate their markets and to look after themselves, and the small countries must really get in there and establish their existence, if nothing else, and see if they could help to define the process of liberalization. So that is a large shift. Right now, foreign policy is trade policy, and trade policy is foreign policy. So this is a sizable shift away from 1979.
And of course, economic diplomacy will mean that your foreign policy workers, your foreign policy strategists and technicians must take cognizance of this new change. Are you doing any kind of training in that area to get your workers and your foreign policy workers oriented to economic diplomacy?
Well, there's a lot more going on now than went on before in that sense, because the sheer weight of conducting a foreign policy for a small Caribbean country is colossal, because you need to have a presence in the United Nations, you need to have a Washington presence, you need to look at all the Latin American states and see what's going on in Mercosur and the Andean Pac, and you need to have people out there. The Asian tigers were developing, and you need to look out there too. Africa is still a sleeping giant, as they say, and we all hope that within the next century they'll stop sleeping. And so you have to look at what's happening in Johannesburg, what's happening in West Africa too. So it's incumbent upon small states to keep their eye open in all these areas. Now that calls for straight economics. You have to virtually decide of how much representation you could have vis-a-vis how much fertilizer you'll give to your farmers,
right,
or bread to your people. So these decisions are vital, and we're getting as much training as we can in those areas. Now diplomacy doesn't turn on a good handshake, a smile, and a drink. It's more hard-nosed now. It's what you could get and what it cost you.
George Odlum, the Foreign Minister of Saint Lucia, speaking here on a wide range of issues that affect the Saint Lucia and the Caribbean. We're going to take a short break, and when we come back, we'll get into some issues like Cuba and the shipwrighter, and of course CARICOM and CARICOM-US relations. Don't go anywhere. Carib Nation will be right back.
You're watching Carib Nation Television.
Welcome back to Carib Nation. We're having a conversation with Mr. George Odlum, the Foreign Minister of Saint Lucia. Mr. Odlum, a troublesome issue, a persistent issue, one that has not been resolved, and one that, in my view, must be resolved if the Caribbean is going to move forward. That's the issue of Cuba. Certainly, you yourself have been personally and politically involved in trying to bring awareness of Cuba and what's going on there to the Caribbean. Now that you're in a position of quote-unquote power, having been in government and so on, first of all, do you think that we have to get Cuba into the bosom of hemispheric relations as quickly as possible?
I think so. I think it's an aberration that Cuba is not part of the CARICOM thrust. I think there was a lot of wrong-headedness on the part of the United States on this issue. I think for some reason there's some kind of blind spot, because when you do speak to the American diplomats and even to the president himself, in reasoning, he reasons fairly well on this, but as if there are issues and things that we can't see too clearly, which seem to keep back the process. I think in the past decade, the Caribbean leaders have firmed up beautifully on this. It was a pipe dream a long time ago when I tried to bring the realities of the Cuban existence and the importance of the Cuban Revolution to the Caribbean as a whole, to the people on the street. It was a long struggle to explain it, because officialdom was implacably against the discussion of Cuba in that way. But there's an interesting phenomenon now. I think the people of the Caribbean are ready to embrace Cuba, and the leaders just have to find a way to get the link up going. And right now there's almost total solidarity inside the CARICOM for accepting Cuba in all the negotiation processes. I feel there's less resistance too among the American people now, and I feel that it's just an administrative hitch that they must get over. The presence of the Cubans in Miami, the strong force, the exiles there, a leader has died recently, and that might even have a marginal impact in neutralizing some of that hostility. And so I see the road clear for better days between Cuba and America, and ad idem, Cuba, America, and the Caribbean, being together.
Let's come back to the English-speaking Caribbean.
Yes.
From the time of federation in 1958, we've been grappling with this whole issue of Caribbean integration. It has gone through various forms, from the federation through CARIFTA, now CARICOM. And it seems to me that over the last 5 years or so, we've seen some monumental movement in terms of bringing the integration movement closer. Yet the agenda, the dream is not realized. First of all, for the benefit of our listeners and our viewers, talk a little bit about that dream which you and others of your generation have been working tirelessly for since the 1960s. Talk a little bit about what that Caribbean, that pan-Caribbean really means for us as a Caribbean people.
Well, from way back we felt that one of the fundamental problems of the Caribbean was the awareness and self-consciousness of the Caribbean man. When America was talking black power, I think the Caribbean used it as a lever for raising the consciousness of their people, showing them that they could pull themselves up by their own bootstraps. The theory was that slavery had left a psychological sort of weakness in the Caribbean man that he felt for, when I say man, that embraces woman
also, right?
The Caribbean people, that they were sort of a substandard people in global terms. And there was need to use the thrust of the Black Power movement to empower them, to let them see that black is beautiful, that you're as good as the next man, you could do it, that you have a history in Africa. And that type of education was probably that was exactly what produced the reggae
Yes.
and Bob Marley
Of
in
course.
Jamaica, and the powerful people you see all around the Caribbean. Probably it was this thrust which brought out the Sobers and the aggression in Viv Richards. You know, they're making their mark. They're making a mark for their people. And this we thought was what we had to consolidate by bringing the entire Caribbean together, that is including French, Spanish, everything. We had the dream of really one Caribbean, and we thought that that would be a powerful motive force in the world, because if you analyze it, in the councils of the world, there are a lot of Caribbean people who've made very important marks and have helped in global processes. If you take the winds of change in Africa, it was people like Padmore and CLR James that you know, were the intellectual ideas behind that movement. Then you have, well, people like Sir Arthur Lewis and Derek Walcott. You have a lot of powerful Caribbean men from Jamaica right around. And we thought that that could make a tremendous impact on the world if we could liberate that. And you see where the illiteracy thing was part of liberating that. Mm-hmm. If we wiped out that illiteracy and gave the nations as a whole the confidence that they could move, that is why now everyone's come to the conclusion that human resources, the development of human resources, is the way to go in developing the Caribbean. And if we do that through education, we can compete globally, despite the lack of resources. The global processes going on, the liberalization of trade and the formation of blocs, point the way to the fact that the integration of the Caribbean is a categorical imperative.
Mm-hmm. And certainly the need for grounding continues. The situation may have changed from what it was in the 1970s and the 1960s and the 1980s, but certainly the struggle for liberation, the struggle for uplifting the poor and the powerless remains a constant struggle. And you, George Odlum, has been one of the persons who has led the way, has been a pioneer in this movement. I want to thank you for agreeing to speak to us here on Carib Nation, and it's been a real pleasure meeting up with you.
Thank you very much. The pleasure is mine.
And I hope you enjoy this program as much as I did. As you can tell, I really do enjoy doing interviews like these because it gives me an opportunity to talk to people who have blazed the trail, who have been there, who have set the stage for us to be where we are in the Caribbean today. Until the next time, this is David Hines saying thank you for tuning in to yet another edition of Carib Nation. And remember, as always, our motto is one people, one culture, one Caribbean, one nation. See you next time.